Welcome to the Journeyman's Bits. Just after 12 o'clock, yellow hinge stiffy on the margin, the far margin that is. These are the components I use to make the pop-up section for the hinge stiff rig. Now I like to use a straight pointed hook as opposed to a beak one, which would be the norm, but any decent chod filament as well will do. Anyway, take a length of the chod filament and put it in through the back of the eye, so you have the curve, the natural curve of the filament in the position that you'd actually want it. Then I go round the shank eventually 10 times, but as I'm going round I release it, so I'm not putting any additional twist into the filament. Just round, let go of it, so I'm not twisting it. Round, not twisting it. And I'll tell you, I go up the shank 10 wraps, which gives me a reasonable size D that I'm looking for. I find that about 10 wraps down the shank of a size 6 hook ends up around the point area. And then to finish off, I go back over the top of those wraps down towards the eye of the hook to lock it off. And you'll see at the end of it that the natural curve of the filament is in exactly the right place for the curve I want for the pop-up section. Next thing I do is to put the thinking angler's ring swivel onto the extended tag end that's going to form the D section. Poke the end of that back through the eye and pull it up reasonably tight. Trim the excess off and then very carefully just blob the end of it. And then once it's cooled, just gently ease that blob back towards the eye of the hook, so you're forming a D on the back of the hook with the flexi ring swivel on it. Now, the way I do it, it should end up with the natural curve still maintained in it. Right, now for the actual boom section, I use Illusion in 30 pounds, and using a flexi ring swivel, I tie an overhand figure of 8 loop with the swivel in it, and that will eventually be attached to the pop-up section. Again, I steam the knot down and then trim it off fairly close, and again carefully I just blob the end of it very slightly. Now I generally make my boom section about 180mm long. So I cut it off oversize, slide on a long anti-tangle sleeve in the khaki, and then I tie an overhand figure of 8 loop in the end again. It's the same procedure. I steam the knot down, cut the excess off, and again carefully just blob the end of it. Then the knot is covered up with the anti-tangle sleeve. So that's the boom section. Then the next thing I do is to tie the pop-up section onto the eye of the flexi ring swivel. Now, I tend to do them quite short, but you aim to tie them slightly shorter than you actually want them, because when you steam the knot shut and put a bit of tension in it, it becomes slightly longer. So I do a 2-turn blood knot. So you go twice round the main pop-up section and then back through the loop that you've created, and then just ease that down. Put a bit of tension on it with the puller tools, and again I steam that so the knot sits down really nicely. Again, trim it off and carefully blob the end of it. And just mould a bit of the tungsten putty around the top eye and the knot that I've just created. And then you can impart just a little bit of curve into that pop-up section if you've lost it. And there you have it. Well, that's my version of the Hinged stiff rig that works so well on Journeyman's Tales Part 2. Now, I don't know how popular the stiff rig is these days. I think the more modern version is to have a softer link, which is a bit more versatile depending on the bottom you're fishing over. But I knew I was fishing over a relatively clean bottom, especially at that time of year, very little weed growth. But it could have been the stiff rig that did the job. It could have been the colour of the boilie. Who knows? There's so many imponderables in carp fishing. But anyway, once you've managed to tie that rig, you've got yourself a chod rig. If you take the link off, you can fish it as a chod rig. Now, that's not something I do a huge amount of, but the extension from that is the flick rig. This is Ian Russell's well-documented flick rig as tied by me following his instructions. The main difference in this rig is that the hook is a long shank and the stiff link is replaced with a soft, heavy braid from Avid called pin down. The braid being tied to the ring swivel with a 4-turn grinner knot. It then morphs into the reverse combi rig if it needs a name. In this case, the ring swivel is omitted completely and the hook link is tied to the stiff filament with an Albright knot. To tie the Albright knot, you firstly need to determine how high you want the length of the pop-up. Once you've done that, fold the bristle filament over to form a small loop. Then, taking your pin down braid, pass it through the loop that you've made in the bristle filament, and then give yourself a nice long tag, plenty to work with, and then you wrap that round the bristle filament, working back up towards the hook slowly. In this instance, I've gone 6 times round. Once you've completed the 6, go back over the top of the 6 whippings you've just done 3 times back towards the loop in the bristle filament. Then you need to pass the end of the tag back through the loop in the bristle filament the same way that you went into it. So that both pieces of braid are coming out the same side of the bristle filament loop. Then, as with all knots, moisten it down, pulling the tag and the main piece of hook link together, slide it down to tighten it up. Trim it off, leave yourself a good 5mm because you're going to cover it in putty anyway. Cut off the bristle filament. So some people like to blob it. I don't tend to bother normally. And then just wrap around a bit of tungsten putty to balance or counterbalance the pop-up. It's just then a case of cutting off the length of hook link that you require. I mean, if you're fishing over quite a bit of weed, then you have a longer hook link than you would do if you were fishing on low-lying debris. And that's the finished rig. So there you have it. That's my version of the Hinged stiff rig that without the link on becomes a chod rig, and if you put a soft link onto it, it becomes Ian Russell's famous flick rig. And I used that a number of years ago on Smith Pool and had some really nice fish with it, fishing over low-lying weed. And I said at the time, when I'm using it, I fish it with a buoyant bag. Now there's just a small bag with some crumb and pellet in. Inside it is some dissolving foam that will make the bag float. And then I just attach that to the hook. When it hits the bottom, it holds it up above any low-lying debris or weed. The bag melts, and then the whole lot just drops down gently onto the spot. And obviously, when it's sucked up, it just shoots up quite easily into the fish's mouth, and you can make that link as long as short as you want, depending on the conditions you're fishing over. Anyway, my Hinged stiff rig, the way I put it together, turns it into a flick rig. I hope that's of use. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for subscribing, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again soon. Cheers for now. Well, that's my version of the Hinged stiff rig. And that's the joys of working at home. Okie dokie.